Did you get to hang with David Bowie when you were making that?
Oh, yeah, man.
What was he like?
Oh, man, he was the best.
Yeah?
Yeah. Super cool, super generous. The first time I met him, actually, I was in the studio.
How are you?
I'm doing all right, Tom. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Congratulations on the Golden Globe nomination.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be back in Toronto, where really kind of, I guess, the heat began for our film with the Toronto Film Festival, although I am 3 months late for that. But it's good to be here because, after that, the film really picked up a good deal of momentum. So now here we are, and there's all this buzz, as they say, around it. So thank you, Toronto.
I was sort of wondering, you don't, forgive me, you don't strike me as sort of an accolades-based actor, but I never really had thought that sometimes these accolades can just help the project that you're working on.
Yeah, it's kind of an odd aspect in some ways of what we do. All of a sudden we become competitors to fellow artists, and it's strange. And, it's kind of the shiny stuff that glitters around our work. When I'm on set, if there are any thoughts about such things that kind of filter into my head, I immediately have a series of buttons that I press to delete all of it, because it's completely distracting from the core thing, which is obviously the story that we're telling and the way we're going about doing that. So, yeah, obviously now, if we're getting this type of attention, it means that the film is being well received. It also means we're getting a lot of support from the studio, which is nice. MGM, Orion, Amazon are excited about it, and so it's better than the alternative. Where there is no interest and there's no support. So, given the two, we'll take this. And I suppose if they have to hand these things out, then sure, we'll take them. But really, I'm more proud of the film that we made, and that people are taking it in and finding a bit of themselves inside of it and enjoying it. So.
Well, let's talk a little bit. I usually, in the introduction to these interviews, try to summarize the plot as best I can, but I didn't in this case because I feel like there's so much to the film, and I kind of wanted to hear it from you. But I will say that your character is feeling conflicted, frustrated, and perhaps underappreciated in his career and in the dynamics within his family. Tell us a little bit about what's at the heart of Monk's frustration.
Well, Monk is an academic and a writer. He writes from a perspective of intellectual and creative freedom. His interests are his own, but he writes things that are kind of esoteric, reinterpreting Greek mythology and the like. In the book, which the film is based on, a book called Erasure by a writer named Percival Everett, Monk has these moments where he drifts off and meditates about fly fishing and the intricacies of outsmarting a fish, or woodworking. They're wonderful because it shows the kind of peculiarities of his interest for a man like him as perceived by the outside world. And it also shows this kind of lovely solitudinous side of him, which we see in the film. But so he's his own guy, writing from that perspective, but nobody wants to buy his stuff. They're not interested. Those few people who still read aren't interested in buying his books. So out of frustration, he decides to write an urban novel, kind of a novel for the masses. He encounters the work of a writer played by Issa Rae, and he feels that this work is beneath him. So out of spite, he writes this novel under assumed name, and it blows up. It's biggest selling novel of his career. And at the same time, his family is going through crisis after crisis, and he finds himself at the center of that, having to be caretaker of his mother, but in a larger sense of the family as well. So while he's forced now to live this dual identity as himself, but also this character Stag R. Lee, who's written this book allegedly, he's dealing with the ordinariness of family life. And so what's wonderful about the two aspects of the film is it plays on the tropes and stereotypes of, a perception of what a man like him is supposed to be, a black man in America, while at the same time, his life is just like anyone else's. And and the humanness that we show there contrasts wonderfully with the ridiculousness of the other side. Cord Jefferson, who adapted the book and directed the film, has really done a wonderful job of balancing the many aspects of the story.
He did say that you were his only pick for this role. He did say, my understanding is he said to you, I need you to do this film for me, and there's no plan B.
No plan B. Yeah, yeah.
Why do you think he said that to you?
Well, I'm not exactly sure why. Obviously, he'd seen my work. He appreciated what I'd done, and he saw himself in this character and in this book. And I think in some ways there are some similarities between Cord and I, and he saw me, in this role. I'm not exactly sure why, but I'm glad he did, because when I read the script, I connected with it on a couple of levels, but particularly connected to the story of a man who's asked to be caretaker to his mother and to his family. He's like the little boy with his thumb in the dike of his family. It's it's crumbling around him, and I could appreciate that. I was going through an experience that's very similar to that when I received the script, and so it touched me on an intimate level.
Obviously, I wouldn't get you to talk about anything you don't want to talk about, but you were going through an experience like that. Like you had to go from caretakey as a child to caretaker.
Yes, in a flash. Well, Cord mentions that his mother had passed a few years before he read the book, and that he had to become caretaker to her for some time along with his siblings. Likewise, my mother passed. Both from cancer. My mother passed about a year or so before I received the script. I had the good fortune of being raised by two women, my mother and my aunt, her eldest sister, who is now 94 years old.
Still with us.
She's still with us.
God love her.
Yeah, retired nurse. Her mind is sharper than mine. And but she came to live with us in New York after my mom passed. And of course, I have two kids who are now college age. But all of a sudden, that delusion that we live under when we're younger, that life gets easier as you get older, just evaporated very quickly. And it also asks for sacrifices on the personal level, and there are distractions to your professional life and all of that. It's a complicated time, but it's a necessary time. So that's very much at the center of Monk's circumstances in this film, and it's also an experience that many have had and many will have. And so people that have seen the film, and the film was just released on a limited basis in America now, but people have seen it multiple times somehow because we've had a lot of screenings. But they've connected to that aspect of it. My mother had Alzheimer's, and I was asked to, tasked with taking care of her, or my brother and sister are exactly like that. I mean, it's really wonderful because, yes, this is a family that's populated by Tracy Ellis Ross and Sterling K. Brown and the incredible Leslie Uggams and a wonderful actor named Myra Lucretia Taylor, who plays the caretaker since we were children of the family. It's a family of black folks, but it's a family that's, as a friend of mine says, put the fun in dysfunction. And it's, it's maddening, but at the same time, despite of itself, loving like any other family. And so people across backgrounds have really found themselves, in this film in wonderful ways. And I think particularly at a time, at least in America, that's so incredibly divisive, it's a good thing if it only lasts for the 2 hours that the film that the film takes place.
I tell you what I think, that the film gives no easy answers to anything.
Yeah.
It gives no easy answers to the family dynamics part of it. Like,
Right.
when I was, you start thinking about this stuff as you get older yourself,
Yeah.
and my father passed on a little while ago. So
I'm
you start
sorry.
thinking about this kind of thing, you know?
Yeah.
And, I was watching the film and I was thinking to myself, oh, there's no real lesson here. The lesson here is just that, life gets complicated as you get older. And I thought that was the lesson of the other plot as well. I mean, you mentioned that your character Monk, he's living in this world where, I mean, he's living in our world where the publishing industry, the media industry, the critical industry, what people buy tends to treat, if I can say this, like tends to treat blackness as sort of a monolith, that there's only sort of one appropriate type of black story that gets labeled as brave, and these are qualities that we want. And so I was sort of watching the film waiting for the lesson, and then your character sort of gets criticized again towards the end. A very complicated film, even when it talks about that part of the plot too.
Sure. I think the attempt is to try to raise the level of dialogue.
Yeah.
Percival Everett, the writer of the novel, and Cord are fluent in these issues, in the issues of race and identity and language and context and history and all of that. So they provide a platform for a lively, smart discussion, which, again, particularly in America, is not often, and most often not, the case. We're super dumb. We lack a fluency in these things. And even though race and identity inform all of us, even when we want to deny it every day and have since the beginning of our country, we're afraid to talk about it. We don't know how to talk about it. And so we never really have productive conversations around these issues. And we progress not at all. In this case, what I think we've done is provided an invitation for better questions, a livelier, smarter dialogue. We're not trying to provide answers, but we're inviting everyone to join us in this conversation and have a bit of a laugh at it at the same time. So it's well, again, give credit to Cord for the way he managed it. It's unfortunately, I think, a rare thing.
Could you relate to? I understand how you can relate to Monk on the family side of the plot. Could you relate to Monk on the other side of the plot as well?
Yeah, certainly. There are pressures and expectations from the outside that I've felt. I don't think, however, that the criticisms, if there are criticisms in our film, are targeted only at the outside. I think there is an inward gaze, too, that suggests that even within the black community, maybe we take on some of these, this external disparagement and call it our own. Sometimes we don't act from a point of view necessarily of appreciating the freedoms that we have, or the appreciating the creative liberties that we have, that we're still stuck somehow in the rut of external expectations or perceptions of who we are. So we're kind of, in this film, equal opportunity misanthropes. Throwing darts, 360 degrees. But so, yes, I mean, I have experienced some of the pressures from a creative standpoint, but at the same time, what I've tried to do throughout my career is focus on what I could handle and what I could control, which was my work. And I've tried to be flexible in the way that I work. One, because I thought that's how you do it. You went about it. I loved Dustin Hoffman, for example. Played one character in Marathon Man, another in Midnight Cowboy, and then another entirely in All the President's Men. I love that way of acting. So that's what I tried to learn and tried to build as an actor. And as a result, it allowed me this flexibility to go from Westworld to James Bond to Basquiat to Muddy Waters and Cadillac Records to this film now, and to Wes Anderson. It's, I enjoy being able to invite myself and feel comfortable in many different types of creative rooms and literal rooms as well. So, yeah, the pressures are there, but also I think we have to give ourselves credit at times for having more agency, power, and freedom than perhaps we often do.
You mentioned your aunt was a nurse.
Yeah.
She's a retired nurse, and your mom was a.
My mom was a lawyer. Yeah.
How do you end up in TV and film, and how do you end up? How does that? Because you're not a nepo baby, are you?
No, not by not by any means. There's a really very simple explanation as to why. My mother also used to take me to the theater when I was younger.
The live theater?
Live theater, regularly, more so than films. There was another husband of a cousin of hers who lived near us, who used to take us to the cinema. But my mom would take us to see all of the shows that toured from New York that came through Washington, D.C., where I grew up. So we'd go to the Ford's Theater, the National Theater, the Warner Theater, and we'd see everything from Annie to Give 'Em Hell Harry, which was a one-man show with James Whitmore about Harry Truman. I saw a one-man show with Avery Brooks about Paul Robeson. Saw Intozaki Shange's For Colored Girls. Saw that incredible play. Saw, just everything, a range of things. And I was just enthralled by those evenings. And I was so, I'm 8 years old. The curtain goes down at the end of the show, and my 8-year-old brain is telling me that, no, the world of the play carries on, even behind the curtain. I was just really taken in. And so that planted the seed in my head. I didn't do anything in high school. I was kind of afraid of it. In fact, the actor in my class at my school who did Eugene O'Neill and Bertolt Brecht and all of these things, he's now a senator from Colorado, Michael Bennett, very good friend of mine.
Right.
And I went on to college. I was a political science major, and I started acting my junior year.
Well, why were you afraid of it? You just said I was afraid of it.
I don't know.
Afraid of what?
I would have, even then, even though I wasn't doing it for some reason, I would have dreams. I remember vividly of being on stage at school and the words not coming, and my mouth unable to. It was just the oddest thing, and I just ran away from it until I couldn't anymore. My junior year of college, and I took a class. I did a play that was kind of a collection of monologues about a book called, based on a book called Bloods, about the recollection of Black Vietnam veterans who had come back home.
Yeah.
And I did that, which was a wonderful experience. I took this class, and the first day of that class, I said, I kind of like it here. I think I've found something that fits me, and that was it. And here I am today, talking to you, Tom.
They say it all led to this moment.
It was all, no, this was the entire purpose, Tom, was to be here now.
They taught you in the class,
table.
they said, listen, you might get an Oscar out of it, you might get a Gold Globe, but truly, Canadian public radio.
That's exactly where you want to be. That's where you want to be.
Let me play a clip from some of your early work. Take a listen to this.
You don't talk to me like that when I'm holding something this sharp, or I might slip and stick it in your heart, if you have a heart.
Oh, I do! Tough little muscle. Never bleeds.
I'll bet. Now, I've been doing drips a long time. I can slip this in so easy you'll think you were born with it. Or I can make it feel like I just hooked you up to a bag of liquid Drano. So you be nice to me.
Jeffrey, tell me what we just heard.
Oh, wow. That is from Angels in America on Broadway, 1993-94, with the late, wonderful Ron Liebman playing Roy Cohn and me playing Belize. Wow. That was pretty cool.
What goes through your mind hearing that?
Oh, man. I immediately, even though I'm on stage at that point, but I was immediately taken backstage to those nights doing the show and hearing the play. That's one of the wonderful things, particularly with a play like that. That's such an extraordinary piece of writing and was so, for lack of a better word, important at the time that we were doing it. And it was. You get to hear those words every night. You're on stage with them, but then you're backstage. And so the play becomes just imprinted into your brain. And that was just, I've had the good fortune at times, and particularly then, maybe it started then, of being in a place with a project and thinking to myself consciously, I am where I'm supposed to be in my life right now. And that took me back there. Yeah.
I could tell it had an effect on you when I was playing.
Yeah. I mean, that was amazing. And I was spoiled at the beginning of my career,
right,
to have that. I mean, I was relatively early. I'd been in New York for about 7 years working in the theater before I got that job. But it was only in the middle of doing that job that I finally was able to say to myself, "You're an actor now." And again, it was the marriage of two interests too. Acting, storytelling with my political interest. There was a friend of mine from college who said to me one night, he came to visit me. He was a super interesting guy, super smart. And he said we would be drinking bourbon. You were a kid, one late night, talking. And he said, Jeffrey, the theater is the highest calling. I think he went to medical school after. I was like, I said, I don't know. And he said, this was so strange. This was probably 6 years before I did. He said, one day you're going to do a play that announces the death of Reagan. And I said, well, that's interesting. But then I thought back, I said, what, George, what were you doing? What kind of crystal ball were you looking at? Because the play was about these people trying, as the play ends, to strive for more life, but it was also about the resistance to recognizing the humanity and the validity of these men and who were sick with this disease and those who were confronted by it, and denying them their citizenship, and particularly pointing to the conservative political response to that led by Ronald Reagan. And so anyway, it was just as well. We did that play when the crisis was still pretty hot in America. And there were times I would look out in the audience and there were people who were clearly sick with the disease, people in wheelchairs and things like that. It was just good. It was good stuff. It was meaningful stuff. And yeah, it spoiled me to the idea that we could work at a pretty high level in this field. Yeah. Cool.
It's sort of my job to try to find connections in people's work where I try to remind myself that sometimes people are just doing work.
Yeah.
But, it's sort of the job of someone who looks like me and it does this kind of job to go like, maybe it's because of this and this and this and this and this, I was thinking a little bit when I was watching American Fiction about, it made me think, maybe because of, again, I'm being, maybe doing some self-disclosure here, about the expectations we put on artists that have nothing to do with the art that they make. And then that led me to thinking about Basquiat, because I got to talk to Basquiat's sisters one time.
Oh, great.
And I had a grand old time chatting with them because I just got to hear about their cool brother, Jean-Michel, who they just loved. And he was a lovely guy.
Yeah.
And I thought about all of the weight that was probably placed on him and the import that was placed on him while he was alive. So then I was doing some research around you and Basquiat to get ready for this interview. I'm getting there.
Okay.
And I read an interview with you. It was pretty quickly you said this, but I wanted to see what you meant by it. You said, when I was doing Jean-Michel Basquiat, I felt a kinship with him. What did you mean by that?
Well, he was a young, creative guy. He was on, the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He was from Brooklyn, but was doing a lot of work living on the Lower East Side and, downtown Manhattan. That was a wild place back then in the 80s, wild and free. It was wonderful. And when I came to New York, that's where I lived. I now have friends who were friends of his. I moved there the month before he passed, but I was kind of traveling in similar circles. And as well, so I understood that part of him. And as well as an artist, he was drawing from a similar reservoir, I think, that I draw from in terms of, if you look at his work, his references to American history through the lens of black folks, his homages to people like Muhammad Ali, Miles Davis, the undiscovered genius of the Mississippi Delta. Those are all people and forces that are very close to me that I draw from as well. I just got him. I got his language, his visual language, and his poetic language, which is really beautiful. And so, I felt a kinship with him. And the more that I learned about him, the more that I studied him, the more I kind of fell in love with him and his work. And so I felt very protective of my side of telling his story when he did that film, particularly because there were not a lot of people outside of the art world who were aware of him. And so in some ways we were introducing him and his work to this wider global audience for the first time. And as you've seen since that film, I mean, he's become, and I'm not saying it's entirely our responsibility, of course. It's the responsibility lies with him and the power of his work. Yeah. But we helped give a little boost to the reception of him. But since that, I mean, he's become maybe the most popular artist of the last, certainly 25, 35 years. I mean, it's incredible the way that he has become almost ubiquitous on landscapes across the world. It's pretty cool.
What is that like for you when you see one of these auctions go up for, $11 billion or whatever it is, Well,
I think back to the time I was in Julian Schnabel's studio. Julian directed the film, and he was so, generous with me in giving me space to paint. And I would go at any time of day, at night, and just go in and sit and paint. And I remember one day, the producers of the film were also art collectors. And I remember one day several days being in the studio surrounded by about 24 Basquiats that they had freshly purchased, because they had a sense that maybe the value was going to increase. And I would use them as references for canvases that I was working on, and I would try to take a bit of this, an image from here and place it here and try to create my own Frankensteinian Basquiat.
Okay.
But it was a way of training myself to be a painter.
You'd actually try to make the art yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. This was I spent a good probably 6 months just painting so that I would feel at ease when we had to do it on camera.
So I'm sure you were thinking, I should have asked him. Can I have one of those?
Oh yes. That was a mistake. That was a mistake, made by youthful, enthusiasm just to be there. I did get a Schnabel as a part of my pay.
Yeah.
But that Basquiat is still out there somewhere.
Waiting for you.
Just waiting.
Did you get to hang with David Bowie when you were making that?
Oh, yeah, man.
What was he like?
Oh, man, he was the best.
Yeah?
Yeah. Super cool, super generous. The first time I met him, actually, I was in the studio, and I was there painting. It was an afternoon, and I remember the door opens, and in walks David Bowie. I knew he was going to be playing Warhol, but in he walks. And I'm kind of on my knees painting on this camera, and he walks by. And he just kind of squats down next to me, and he says, do you mind if I watch? And I said, well, I think I'm going to have to get used to it. And we had a laugh, and that was the beginning of it. And from that point on, yeah, man, he was just so cool. He had meant so much to me, obviously, as, more so as an artist, as a musician, of course. I mean, there were times in my life where David Bowie songs were the soundtrack, and he was just, but he was so funny, so open.
I've heard he was very
so
funny.
supportive. Yeah, man, and then I would see him after we finished filming, and he just was, ever gracious and generous, and went, we were in the hair and makeup trailer one day, and David comes in, Gary Oldman is there. David comes in and he says, hey, I'm not going to do an accent because I'll butcher it sound ridiculous. He said, hey, you want to hear some music? I'm like, yeah, sure, David. He pulls out a cassette. I think we were still listening to cassettes at that time, yeah. And he plugs it in, and it's his new album.
No.
That has not been released, an album called Outside.
Yeah.
And we're listening to this thing, and with David, and there's a guitarist named Reeves Gabrels who plays lead on this thing, and David's listening, and he's air guitaring to this song. And I'm sitting there going, wow, and it's the most badass album. And some of the music is in the film, because it was really, in some ways, so weirdly autobiographical, too, or biographical as relates to Basquiat's life. The theme of this guy, and there's this song, Poor Soul, he never knew what hit him. And so anyway, there's this stuff. So then, later after we filmed, he invites me to his concert when he came through New York with 9 Inch Nails, and he's singing largely songs from this album that most people were largely unfamiliar with.
Yeah, it was like a kind of an industrial record that he had made, or very heavy. I'm Afraid of Americans was on that record, I think.
No, this would be prior to that. That song was prior.
Okay.
But this is really, it's kind of operatic, and it's, but it's beautiful. Check it out, Outside. Anyway, playing this thing, and I'm sitting there, and I've known this album for a while now, and it was almost like, this is my concert, I don't think the film had come out just yet, but I'm like, yeah, this is me and David here, just doing a thing. No, he was just brilliant, man, and he and Dennis Hopper and Chris Walken and Gary Oldman and Willem Dafoe, all of them were like, they were like, I was like, I wanted to work like those guys, particularly Gary Oldman as an actor, and they were all so cool with me. It wasn't a bad way to start out as a lead in a film. It was pretty cool.
Do any of these characters? Maybe this is a good way to close. I was planning on closing by asking you whether there's parts of this character Monk that stay with you, afterwards. But I wonder sometimes whether that's a non-actor way of thinking about things, whether you guys just take these characters off and just move on with your day.
Probably better for the sanity to do that.
Yeah.
But, there's certainly things that you learn from walking in another person's shoes. Certainly that was the case with Angels in America. With this, what I love about this film and what I love about this character is, yes, he's a bit of a mess. He's a bit of a curmudgeon. He's, got sharp, elbows and likes to, throw verbal punches here and there. But he goes on a journey, and he's not the same man at the end of the film that he is in the beginning. And I like that he evolves. So maybe if there's anything that I take away or I'd like to carry with me of this character is the continuation of the evolution, that, I grow, I change, I get better.
Thank you so much for coming in. I always love getting the chance to talk to you.
Thanks, Tom.